I'm Amy Imhoff. This is Roy Ollson.
Hello.
Hello. We're here to talk about the Scully Effect. So Roy, why don't you tell us a little bit about you? And I know you just did a very wonderful panel with Frank, but we want to hear a little bit about how you started watching and about your favorite Scully moment.
I came along to the X-Files a little bit later after the show had ended, simply because they didn't allow like 2-year-olds to watch the X-Files back in the day. And I came about it like during high school, which I think is like the perfect time for like Dana Scully to be your role model. You know, I like science and biology, and like those were the courses that were my favorite. And she was always like the smartest, so it was great. Like as soon as I started watching, I knew I was like in trouble. Like this was all downhill from here. And that's how I started watching. It was before streaming, so it was like difficult to get a hold of. It was before the DVDs had all been released.
Back in the day, we did not have Netflix.
It was a mess. But yeah, and then it just like spiraled into XFN at some point. So I'm not sure how I got from like, oh, you know what, I need a new television show this summer to like, here we are. But and then my favorite Scully moment, I mean, such a classic when she's in Fight the Future and she just like tells him to evacuate the building. Like, don't think. It's just great. I love when she's in charge and just, you know, she gets it done. She's like, it doesn't matter if there's not time, you're going to do it now. And like she just leaves, you know, she's done, you know, it has to happen. So.
Yeah. So my background for the X-Files, I started watching when I was 12, so that was about season 3. I came in kind of the end of 3, beginning of 4, and I just was mesmerized by this redhead who rewrote Einstein and kicked ass, and it was, you know, she was fantastic. And I have personally have written over 100 articles online. I've written for the Mary Sue. I've written for StarTrek.com. I do a lot with women in genre media, and I host panels around the country now. So, and Star Trek Las Vegas is coming up in August. I'll be there. And yeah, I've become very used to speaking in public about this thing that I love, and it's really been a fantastic journey for me. And I ran the Scully's Desk campaign right before season 11 started. I figured our girl needed a desk. So we did it Indiegogo, and we raised over $1,000 for one of Jillian's charities. And I have to say my favorite scene with Scully that really resonated with me was when she yells at Boggs in Beyond the Sea. And, you know, she says to him, if something happens to Mulder because of what you've done, no one's going to stop me from, you know, gassing you out of this life for good. And it's just, she's so forceful and strong, and she's so young. And you realize how young she was when she was filming that. You know, that's season 1. Like, she was like 24, 25. And it's just incredible to me that she had so much presence even then. And, you know, what we really want to talk about today is celebrating Scully and celebrating her contribution, and not just to women in STEM fields. I really think that the Scully effect goes far beyond women in STEM fields and law enforcement fields, although that is obviously a very, very big part of what she has accomplished, but also changed the way women on television were subsequently written and cast. And I think that is just as an important impact as women in STEM, is to see these women that we love and the women that we currently love on TV. You know, we want to dig deeper into really what she has accomplished and what the character of Scully has done. And Roy is here to help me do that. So I wanted to say, to start by saying, if any of you have read the article that Rebecca Traister, who is a feminist journalist and author, has written about Scully, it was for Salon.com. She wrote it in 2008, before I Want to Believe, and she said, you know, there was a time not so long ago with a sci-fi series with a woman at its core, a heroine whose major goals were about more about disproving the existence of extraterrestrial life than marrying Big, obvious dig at Sex and the City, a chick who spent more time chasing flukeworms down the toilet than trying on shoes. And we need Scully back, even for a moment. And that was just really powerful when I read that. And, you know, it stayed with me the last 11 years since she's written that, since that movie's come out. You know, we need women like Scully on TV. We need women like Scully in our everyday lives, you know, as teachers. And so I'm sure some of you have grown up watching Scully and become teachers and become law enforcement and become, you know, women in science fields that have really have the power now to influence and even the people who are coming after you, and inspire women who are, you know, in school alongside you. And, you know, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
As far as inspiring
Yeah,
women in science.
you know, just, you know, inspiring each other and meeting women in the field and women in your professional career.
Yeah, so I actually know a lot of female files that are like actual scientists and like they conduct research, and you know they thought of Scully kind of the same way like a lot of us did, as this like, you know, all-knowing, smart, gorgeous, like kick-ass woman who could do anything. And you know, I think we can all come to that, and then for a lot of us it's led to like science, but there's so many ways you can like be inspired by that and take that, especially for some of us who are young when we're watching the show, when you need that type of like reinforcement. But even when I go back and I watch her, you know, do like just rattle off this science with like incredible accuracy, like that's hard to do, and I'm in the middle of like filling my brain with that type of knowledge right now, and it's like,
Roy is in vet school.
So much of it,
which I don't think we said. Did we say you were in vet school?
Sometime, yes, I am, and filling your brain with that, and being able to like bounce from one idea to the next and be able to link them like that. It's really difficult, and so I still look to her and be like, you know what, I gotta study harder. Like Scully would not be marathoning like 7 seasons of Grey's Anatomy during medical school. Like I gotta stop. Nothing on Netflix. You know, I still see that as, you know, you can push yourself to know that and be that smart and be a good doctor or researcher or, you know, FBI agent or whatever it is. So, you know, I think I know a lot of people that have taken from that and gone in all different directions, and for some of us that was science, and I still enjoy catching up with that science now that like I understand from a medical perspective like what she's talking about, so that's been fun.
Yeah. I also want, you know, if you guys want to think about what the women on TV looked like when Scully came into the picture, you know, in 1993 when the show premiered, I think the women on the top TV were a lot fewer and further between, you know, Seinfeld, Home Improvement, you know, some of these other shows that were just very male-driven. Baywatch, obviously, Friends and ER debuted in 1994, so they were a little slightly after Scully. But like we had Roseanne, Murphy Brown, Grace Under Fire, and that was kind of it. I think maybe out of all of the shows that were on when like 1993 happened, maybe Murphy Brown was the only one that Scully would have actually watched. I really think that you know, these women in the 90s, there was this void that was dying to be filled by somebody like Scully. And then, of course, a couple years later, we got Captain Janeway on Star Trek Voyager, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You know, we kind of, you know, like some of them went on Babylon 5, you know, but that was Babylon 5 was just so kind of niche at that point. It wasn't like appointment TV the way Friends was, or you know, and the women on Friends, you know, they had very like traditional female jobs and female roles, where Scully was just breaking boundaries and shattering glass ceiling everywhere. And to kind of see how this casting, the way that they went a different, you know, we have all heard the story how the network was not so sure about Jillian. They're like, oh, she's not like a big boobed Pam Anderson type, like what are we gonna do? It's more to say that she not only opened up the way these characters were written and kind of were able to be badass ladies, you know, it changed the way the appearance of women too, people were looking like, oh, other women other than big boobed blondes can be sex symbols. And you know, I think I'm how much older am I than you? I'm like 8 years older than you. Yeah, so having seen that, and then Roy coming in and seeing it, you know, coming into more of a Netflix era, or like being able to having to search out Scully. You know, what was the year that you started watching?
It was summer 2007, so it was like right before they were like, we're coming back with a movie. So I waited like a few months, and I was like, oh, okay, it's coming back, like no problem. I didn't have to wait like several years and campaign anyone. So I think it was that summer, and I made like a list because it was airing on like 2 different networks. I think you could get some like DVDs from Netflix, but it was like when you could get like one at a time, and like there was streaming wasn't a thing really. And I had
binge watching was not a thing.
I had to like send away, and then I had to plan what like I would DVR like the ones on like the Sci-Fi network, and then there was also some other network, and like one was in season 7 and the other was like in season 2, and I had no idea. And I think I saw The Truth was like one of the first ones, and I was like, which one's Mulder, which one's Scully, and who are these people?
No.
And eventually I saw everything, but it was out of order.
I love the way how different we were and that we watched it, and how different a lot of the people in the fandom are the way they watched it, and yet we've all come to the conclusion that Jillian is queen, Scully's the best. You know, we just want more of what Scully has to offer, and how even you know, in 2000 and after, in 2008 and after, you know, the women on TV, like I kind of want to like involve you guys a little bit. Like what women on TV have you enjoyed in the last 20 years that aren't Scully? Yell.
I have Laura Roslin. Yes.
Yeah, Laura Roslin. Okay, Laura Roslin from Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah.
What did she say?
Olivia Benson.
Olivia Benson. Very good. Who else? Olivia Dunham. Thank you. Fringe is on my to-do list.
I've got another one. Samantha Carter, SG-1.
Oh yeah,
She
Samantha
was a
Carter.
great scientist.
She is
yeah.
great. Yep. Stargate. Who else? I have to say for the ladies of Firefly. Yes,
That's a great
11
one.
from Stranger Things. Definitely a descendant of Scully. Who else? The women of The Good Wife.
Alicia Florrick.
Alicia Florrick. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you? Anyone else?
I watched Timeless recently, and it's like a good little tiny show that's like led by a female historian who kind of learns to live through history, and it was canceled like twice,
Yeah.
which is the story of my life watching television. But that was a fun
Warehouse
different
13.
approach. Yeah.
Micah. Micah's basically like she's an agent of a secret agency. And she is the nerdy, I read a book instead of going outside kind of a person, and I love her. Who else? Oh yes, from Sigourney Weaver and Alien. She's one of the few who predates Scully. It's her and Leia and like one or two other ladies of sci-fi movies, but on television, which is, you know, obviously arguably more ubiquitous because TV comes into our living room every week. Versus we have to go out and see what the newest movie is, and not everybody always sees the same movie, whereas that's the beauty of Scully being on network television. You know, now you can access and download everything, and we have stuff like The Handmaid's Tale and The Expanse. Who watches The Expanse? Yes? You must watch The Expanse. It's fantastic. The women on that show are fabulous. But all these women that we're talking about are really descended of Scully. You know, most everybody you named, you know, came after 93. These are the women that we talk about when we talk about women in sci-fi. And, you know, the people like shows like Fringe would not exist without the X-Files, right?
Yeah.
And
well,
like
I mean, JJ.
JJ would not exist. JJ Abrams would not have had success with Lost if it weren't for the X-Files.
He wrote the foreword to one of the X-Files books.
Yeah, he did.
Because, you know, the X-Files was where he, like, grew up, basically.
Yeah, so to see that these people who are moving and shaking in TV today as producers and directors and everything, they all cite the X-Files as inspiration for these characters the same way that the X-Files was citing Twin Peaks and Night Stalker and, you know, all of these, you know, this is ushered in kind of a golden age of TV. And even women on Game of Thrones, even though they've had many, many problems, and we won't discuss Game of Thrones right now. But I mean, you know, like Brienne being a different kind of a woman, being a different kind of a lady knight, you know, somebody who's defending someone, you know, that's very Scully. And the books of Game of Thrones are after Scully. So that's an excellent, you know, a way to talk about the way we watch that. And then maybe you can talk a little bit about how, you know, seeing these women and having this constant reinforcement now that we have such an embarrassment of riches versus what we didn't have in 1993, how that's helped you relate to everything.
I mean, I think it's really nice to, like, have at our fingertips, like, any, like, you know, Samantha Carter, I've been watching, like, a lot of Stargate recently. And, you know, she, like, blew up a sun once, and, like, you know, she knows everything about, like, physics. And, like, I look at that and was like, my physics is, like, really rusty, and I have just no idea what she's talking about. And then you can jump from that, and you can go, like someone mentioned, Olivia Benson, who is just, like, in charge of her own unit now. And I remember, like, back in the day, you know, coming up upon this, like, lady detective and being like, okay, I'll watch this show. And it, like, kind of, like, destroys you a little bit, but at the same time, it's, like,
that show does destroy
really interesting to be able to jump from all these different experiences and be able to, like, binge watch any of them. I think is a welcome distraction in today's age when the world sometimes doesn't treat us as nicely, and it's good to be able to escape.
The government doesn't treat women as nicely.
And it's good to be able to escape.
Like the Handmaid's Tale is happening in real time. But so going off of what you said, I've just lost my train. It just left.
Having all those women to be able to relate to, it's they're right there. Like if I want a female role model, it's not as hard to find these days.
And I feel like the younger girls today have a wealth to choose from as well, and not only that, but also in video games and comics, and the way we're seeing women in the industry are kind of standing up and demanding to be heard and demanding to be recognized for what they do. And I went to a discussion that Anita Sarkeesian had about. She was the one who was affected the most by Gamergate. She was a reporter who talked about video games and, talked about the way women are even drawn and acted and animated in video games. And there's a thing called jiggle physics. I'll let you think about what that means. But you want women to be recognized for more than just their bodies, right? You want women to be recognized for their minds and for what they're contributing to society. And to have met so many amazing women in the fandom who are in STEM fields and who are, Jasa is a Harvard researcher. Yeah, immunologist. She's a Harvard researcher trying to cure cancer. And
I know someone who works at Bethesda Naval Hospital. She does a ton of research and stuff that I could never understand, have that depth, that focus. Mine is much broader. So to see these files who are just as inspired and go on to do these crazy things in science.
And if you guys haven't heard of Dr. Erin McDonald, she's a physicist. She's fantastic. I met her at Star Trek Las Vegas last year. Finally, another woman doing programming for Star Trek. And she's had this incredible trajectory, and she is going to be doing a panel on the Scully Effect at the end of this month in LA with Mayim Bialik from The Big Bang Theory, who's also a physicist in addition to being an actress, and Gina Davis, so the Gina Davis Institute for Gender and Media did the study of the Scully Effect recently. And I wanted Roy to talk a little bit about that study and how, it's not an in-depth study, right? It's 5 pages long.
Yeah.
But it's still an important jumping off point in recognizing where Scully was coming from, and Jillian did that. She filmed the little video that they had, and Julie, from who was the production coordinator on the new seasons of the X-Files. Behind the scenes, she wanted to make sure that was highlighted because she's a young woman in film and production, and Scully is an inspiration to her, of course. Scully Effect study.
Yes.
From Gina Davis.
Basically, we've all kind of anecdotally known that Scully's presence on TV kind of shifted focus for particularly some young women of the 90s who saw those fields as suddenly more accessible to them so that they could reach that. And we've kind of known that's there, and all of us have experienced that. So the Gina Davis Institute, kind of knowing that was there, went and then found out that a lot of people did cite her as someone to look up to, a role model. And it's not a long, in-depth study as to how the course of the 90s was changed by Scully, and what percentage of these people were changed their views or did something more because of her, as opposed to just seeing her as someone to look up to. So we don't really know exactly the depth of it, and I think that would
Which is why I'm writing a book
Yeah.
called Smart Like Scully, an investigation of a feminist icon.
I mean, I think it'll take, books and more research. I think it'll really take years to look back at how, especially now today, the social media landscape can change what we're doing, and that was just another different thing. So I think it'll be interesting to hopefully see more looking into that and how, not just the X-Files and Scully, but how pop culture can change our lives and influence the country. And like Frank said, the X-Files after 9/11 wasn't kind of in step with the country, and how those interactions affect our lives.
That was very,
basically.
to hear him say that, it's just, you think about how true it was, especially, so I was 18 when 9/11 happened, and it changed the mood of everything, and it affected, I think the people who were in high school at that time, it really affected the way we kind of went into the next phase of our lives, into college and into, and then, going into a new election, going into Obama being president. wanting to shift things into a more hopeful tone. And I feel like, now we feel like we've taken like these steps back with, the conservative element that the country is currently in. And I feel like Frank was correct when he said, I'd love to be able to tell those stories now. Like, what would Scully look like now in this era if they were to address the issues surrounding the government? The new show really just kind of dealt with like a more insular look at it, and then they would make the Trump jokes and everything, and we all got it. But I mean, to have an in-depth series about that, even if it wasn't Mulder and Scully, even if it was some other, feminist scientist woman, female character, that they would, take up the mantle of the X-Files. If the X-Files did continue, I wouldn't want it necessarily to be Mulder and Scully, no matter how much I love them.
I mean, it can't go on forever. There has to be an end.
Yes, there has to be an end, but also there doesn't have to be an end in that you can tell other stories.
Yeah, I mean,
it doesn't have to be the X-Files, but
Fox
it could still be
Disney
in
could
the
do
vein of
whatever
that,
they want.
like Fringe.
There could be like an X-Files edition to like Disney World at some point. Like,
That sounds great.
I'd be up for like a sewer ride, like a Fluke Man.
Oh no,
Fluke Man sewer ride.
That's fantastic. I love this.
But I
This
mean,
is good.
it could continue like in any way, shape, or form, basically.
And I think the women of the Expanse are really continuing that, like the mantle of sci-fi and badass ladies on TV.
I've only seen like 2 episodes.
It's okay. But like the mantle is being taken up by other teams of writers and actors and producers. And I think, the story that the X-Files tells, you talked a little bit about it in your panel with Frank, is that Scully has been written by men almost exclusively. And I kind of wanted to discuss a little bit of that with you and with the audience, what you think the advantages and disadvantages of that are.
I mean, I think a lot of times we got really, really lucky with the perspective that some of our male writers like brought to Dana Scully. Like Frank, I think, is one of my favorite people to write Scully. I think Vince Gilligan. Yeah, Glenn was really great. I think he has a great understanding, especially today, of like Mulder and Scully and how they've evolved. So I think, especially for a time when like they didn't have the awareness today of how they should be like kind of adjusting the writers, and like they did a pretty decent job.
Yeah.
I think there were certain parts where it was like clear, like there was a female influence lacking. I mean, Frank talked about Excel's Today, and like that had some issues in it, and I think Postmodern Prometheus had some issues in it.
Anything really surrounding fertility and rape is could always benefit from a woman's touch. Let's put it that way.
And like Scully like gives birth, and then she's like in her silk pajamas, and like
she looks skinny and perfect, and her hair's all blown out. It's like, okay.
There are places where you can see it. I think it could have been a whole lot worse for us. I would like to see, even more. We did see more in season 11, and that was great. I enjoyed an alternate perspective from people who hadn't necessarily been there, but had loved these characters nevertheless.
I think the advantage to having the guys writing it is, especially in the beginning, was that they made her into somebody who just took no crap from anybody. And they really, her word was law. She said something, and it was, she had her authority. Yes, she had to assert the fact that I am a medical doctor several times.
She only says it like 12 times, though, I once counted, and
some
of them are
all?
Justified, so, yeah. Although that's only the early seasons.
It's 12 times in the first season?
The early seasons, I haven't.
You've got a full count? That's like the next blog.
There's probably a couple extra, but most of the time she's like, I'm a doctor, and they're like, a medical doctor? She's like, yeah, I'm a medical doctor. So she's really clarifying, and we shouldn't.
No, I love when she goes up agast local law enforcement, and they're like, who the hell are you,
like
tiny redhead person?
Yeah.
And then Mulder's like, no, you have to listen to her. And I always appreciate that they have Mulder back her up, because that's a big part. You talk about how women in a boardroom, or women in a professional setting. In my career, I've worked with major technology companies, and you really do have to reinforce what women say and amplify it. So there's that technique that they use where the women in the room will amplify what the other woman has already said. So because I've had this happen so many times, whether it's in my friend group and whether it's in a family setting or in a professional setting, where I will say something and either they just don't hear it or they're thinking about their own thing, and then they will say the same thing, and you're like, I just said that. I just said it. And it's not intentional always, but to amplify that and to have that power that you see women in Congress now talking about, women like, Maxine Waters, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Abby Finkenauer, all these young women that have come up in politics. it's definitely a measurable impact that you have to have. And I think that, to see Scully like testifying before Congress, incredible, right? When did that happen? When did that ever happen in all of television? Ever? It hasn't, except for Scully.
Yeah.
And, we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about how the show started as Mulder's journey, but Scully was a lot of people's entry point, and I think remain people's why we stuck around in the fandom. And Roy, take that, run with it.
Chris said that Mulder was the hero, but it was told from Scully's perspective, and I think when we're in like the middle of a scene and something intense or dramatic is happening, it's always kind of like Scully's head who I want to get inside, and I want to, because Mulder's just like aliens,
yeah.
But Scully, like, what is she thinking? Like, how does she justify this? Or when things get like more personal, like the Fight the Future hallway scene, like you can kind of see it on her face, but like, what is she really thinking? And like let's break it down, like pause by it, I always want to.
What's that gaze mean?
Yeah, I always want to know more of like what she's thinking and how she's thinking and how she arrives at that, because she's.
That just seems to me the more fascinating process.
Yeah.
Is where she's coming from, because like you said, Mulder seems to be approaching it with more of a pure faith, like a pure, like he wants this to be he wants it to be the answer to be aliens. Whereas Scully's like, I don't think she wants the answer to not be aliens, but she wants it to be something that she can dig her brain into and like really grasp and understand. Tangible,
Yeah.
And seeing her journey over the, I guess we'll just call it 11 years, I guess, but let's just really call it 9. Seeing her journey over that, especially when Monica and Doggett come in, and she's the one who's championing where they've been, where they've been and where they're going, and the way she relates as a person now has changed. To see that character growth, that doesn't always happen for leads of shows. They're pretty much, either they have a very specific redemption arc, like, like characters on Lost, where they have to go through what they go through on the island, or somebody like in Battlestar Galactica, where it's this major fight for humanity's survival. These shows that, this is this lovely jackhammer out here that I just hear. But anyway, that will just be our dramatic backdrop for when we post this on the internet. To see that change from where she ends when she comes in and she says, I've been assigned to work for Theo, till the point where they end in season 9 and they're in bed and they say maybe there's hope, and they've gone through so much. That's like the beauty of that journey for Scully. Did you want to talk about that a little bit? Or do you...
How she arrived. I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I want to know what she's thinking, and like I feel like if I can like think the same way, maybe I'll be getting somewhere too. But I think in season 8, and I think she felt an obligation to like having both sides be present in that debate, and that even if she wasn't as like open as Mulder would be, like she was going to make sure these things were still investigated, that these crimes still have like victims, these people like maybe some type of like mutant, but they still deserve like someone should pay attention to what's happening. And so I think that was like a combination of her like standard Dana Scully with like I have to fill in, like there's a piece missing here. And she's like perfectly capable of like still being the skeptic and still like pushing for like the unexplained and what's happening, and directing Doggett into investigating this. But
don't you love when she first meets Doggett and she throws the water at him? I was just thinking that. I was just thinking about that.
Like otherwise you had like you were going to hate him when he came on. Like that was like we all felt that way. Like who the hell is this dude? Like where's Mulder? And like I ended up loving Doggett eventually because he proved himself, and like I think Doggett and I feel like the same way about Dana Scully. I think it's clear. Like he just like wants the best for her, and he fights for her even though she doesn't really tell him what's going on some of the time. And but it was great I always enjoy watching her like own someone.
I always watching her own anybody, even if it's in first-person shooter. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
How fantastic is that? Just coming in and taking over. Like that's just the kind of attitude that you feel like you need sometimes in your life. Like when you're like lacking and like you're feeling like a little bit down about yourself, like you just watch a couple of those scenes with her. It's so important. It's necessary. We all feel it. And that's kind of leads me into our next, my next section of this, which is how she affected us in our feminism. And I would really like to hear Roy's point of view because, like I said, I'm a little older than you are. And having you be in your 20s during this crazy time of Me Too and Resist, and nevertheless she persisted, and all these things. And also you being in another country for your veterinary school. Roy's in the UK, and there's, of course, a lot going on in the UK politics with Brexit and Theresa May and everything. It's, it's left this fictional realm as we brought it into our everyday lives. And this generation of women that Scully has empowered, has come back and has something major to say. And you see these rally, the Women's March, you'll see the signs, and they've had Scully on them. Like I definitely saved a whole bunch of those on my computer, and I want to hear your point of view on that, especially being an American in another country, but also coming into your 20s in this era of resistance.
I think I was lucky enough to be raised from a feminist perspective, so it wasn't like that was just kind of how it was to me. My mom worked really hard, my dad worked really hard. It wasn't, there was nothing different there. My grandmother had grown up during the Great Depression, and that was all
very different. My mom stayed at home. My dad is first generation German, very traditional. Kind of gender roles were present in my household, and I think that seeing Scully as this very atypical gender role from what I grew up with is a lot different, I think, than what you experienced.
When I saw Scully, she was just I was seeing things the way I was kind of raised to see them, that was normal to me, and so I was drawn to that automatically. And I thought we had similar views, and as far as how it is in Europe, compared to the U.S., the U.S. I think faces a lot more issues with women's rights than a lot of Europe does. It's not difficult at all to get reproductive health care. It's free. I could walk down the street and I don't need an appointment. It would be nothing to deal with that. Not to say that there's not problems with right-wing nationalism everywhere, but I think because they've established better social safety nets. They have a better social safety net for women in
There's
general.
Universal health care in the UK.
So.
And it's so interesting because you think shows like Breaking Bad, where Vince just came off of X-Files and made Breaking Bad, and Breaking Bad would not have occurred in any other country except the United States.
He could just get free health care in England.
He wouldn't have had to be so worried about his family and what would happen to them after he died. That he became a meth kingpin so he could have enough money for cancer treatment.
Yeah.
But that's the fact that you need to be a meth kingpin to afford cancer treatment in this country is an interesting commentary on that. But to see where Vince, cut his teeth, as it were, and became, really into the character-driven stuff that we got from Breaking Bad, where he started with Mulder and Scully. And Roy having, this great experience, I think, of being abroad and being, seeing all of the different options that are available to women in Europe and the way that they approach things. Yes, white nationalism is everywhere. There's still an anti-immigrant sentiment in a lot of places besides here. But I think it's just different seeing, what she'll tweet or, what versus, what a lot of my friends in Canada will be tweeting and the way that they feel about the show or the way that they feel about even something like Game of Thrones or the way women relate to media and the way we see ourselves reflected back to ourselves, is very important. And I think part of that was experienced in the backlash of season 11. And I did a panel at Spooky Empire where it was just a catharsis. We all needed a group hug about season 11 and everything that kind of Scully had gone through or not gone through that we wish she had gone through. And I wanted to hear from some of the audience, if you guys want to ask questions of us and talk about things that you've experienced in terms of Scully, please line up at the microphone. We'd love to hear from you and ask some good questions, or you can raise your hand and shout it out if you don't feel like being at the mic. But I definitely want to hear from this group about how they feel in terms of Scully in an era of Me Too and an era of resistance, because the X-Files was about resistance, which is hilarious because we've come so full circle to find the truth, as it were. So who has a question? Please come to the mic. Oh, you have a question. Go ahead, Lily.
Scully Effect affect you?
Me personally, yes. The Scully Effect affected me. So I am the T in STEM, technology. I was a technology writer and editor for 13 years. My most recent job before I started my own business in October this past year, doing digital content management. But before that, I was with a couple big companies like Gartner, a couple of startups, and I also taught college writing. And let me tell you, after you teach 40, 18, and 19-year-olds, you are not scared of anything anymore. And they, just having that sometimes you just need to dig into your soul and like come up with that like authority. I was, I look young. I'm not gonna like scare teenage boys into behaving with my, with the way that I approach them. But I said, I want this to be a compassionate classroom. I want this to be a place where you guys feel comfortable coming to me with the difficult questions. When, I read a lot of, I have my master's in literature, so I wanted them to be reading a lot of women writers that they don't normally get in the canon. And I definitely feel that seeing Scully and also Captain Janeway, who are like my twin beacons of awesome in my teenage life, they set this example for me that I wanted to then set for students when I taught. And the way that I also tried to behave when I was in a professional setting in like a meeting or a boardroom or that kind of thing. So yes, the Scully Effect has been very, very present in my life, which is why, and I see all these women online, on Twitter, and we're all just starving for more of Scully and more of discussing this impact. And I think that's why, panels like this are so important, because doing so many conventions, and I've done over 50 panels at this point, I always have women coming up to me being like, oh my God, thank you for saying that. And I'm like, why am I the only one saying it? Like, you have to push the people who are involved with the conventions to put this kind of programming on the stage. And that's why I've been so grateful for X-Fest. There was no question about whether or not this panel should happen. I didn't have to fight for anything. I just said, this is what I do. Can I do it here? And they said, yes, please join us. Like, it was fantastic and not a typical experience that I've had with conventions.
Definitely for me, yes to the Scully Effect. Definitely the S in STEM, just pure science. I studied so much science. I knew from when I was like 5 that I wanted to be a vet, so I knew pretty early on that I was going to have to do a lot of science. And I took so many science courses in college that they're prerequisites. Like, you need to understand the basics of them, but I'm never going to use a lot of in-depth physics in my like day-to-day work. But knowing, like Scully took those same classes. Like, she would have done all of that in her undergrad before she went to med school. And so, it's possible to get it done. I was working a lot, and, I was riding on the equestrian team, and I was getting ready to apply to vet school, and that took like so much effort, but it was always good.
I remember how excited I was when you were like, it's happening. And I was like, oh, she's been working so hard, You just see how hard people have to work in order to get into these fields. It's crazy.
To see like someone else like basically kind of do the same thing, and you know what, she got through it. She got through way worse. Like, it's possible to do it. It seems like insurmountable at the time, but like before you know it, you're like halfway through, and I should really be studying right now, probably.
It's okay. You are studying. Who else? Anybody else?
I actually have 2 different things. Whenever I first started watching, it came out and I was 7, and I was sneaking it because I wasn't allowed. So my only memory is of having a strong character. And the first time in the series that I kind of realized, like, whoa, society isn't always all about women as equals was first-person shooter. At the very end, when they're all concerned, all of the majority ran into that room yelling Mulder. Phoebe was the only one who said Scully, like, to see if she was okay.
Yeah.
And, like, that was like a light bulb thing.
It's a really excellent point. I'm going to use that in future things.
I was like, it's a little thing, but it was blaring to me. And I think I was like 13 at that time when I was like right before high school, and it just nailed, like, this is a problem.
Yes.
And the big thing, I know everybody's season 11. I've always really identified with Scully. more even as an adult, because unfortunately I'm on 7 years of infertility, and I've lost 3 babies along the way, and the way Scully always, no matter what, stood up for William, I was completely gutted when they had her just dismiss him on that pier. I wish we could take that pier just away. But the other side, I'm glad if this is a healthy, normal pregnancy, if she gets that part, that makes me happy from the infertility mama side. But to just have that's not Scully. That's not who my whole life, and she was like, to use an X-Files where she was my touchstone through all this fertility stuff, and then to just wipe it away.
Wow, I'm really sorry you've gone through that.
But
Thank you for sharing it with us, because I feel like that's an important part. They've made it an important part of Scully's character, is that she's dealt with infertility. And I've heard a lot of women say that that's something that they've identified with her. And from the flip side of that, I'm adopted. My brother is not adopted. My mom didn't think she could have kids. She had been told, you're going to have a hard time getting pregnant. So I'm adopted, and seeing Scully dismiss a child she gave up for adoption is a painful thing. And I know that when they had written the first time they kind of see William and talk to him, I know that Jim Wong is an adoptive father. And he wanted to make sure that was dealt with a little bit. The scene in Ghoulie where she talks to what she thinks is William's dead body and everything, I think that was handled incredibly well. And kind of a grieving process for a mother who never got to be a mother. But yeah, I think that, yes, there are a lot of problems with the way they dealt with stuff with her fertility, and to have her, like you said, wash her hands of William, really not her. But I'd like to hear Roy's opinion on that as well.
I mean, I kind of just refuse to accept that.
Yeah, me too.
Basically, the way I worked it out was that Scully was obviously kind of sharing visions with Jackson, and I think that was just going back and forth. I think she would have known that he wasn't dead if they were kind of connected that way. I don't see any world where Scully would be like, yeah, he wasn't really our kid, Mulder. It's not. I just didn't I don't think that happened when I think of it. I don't take it that way, because if that's the way it really is, that's fine. But we have fan fiction.
We have fanfic. We're good. Well, the fact that she didn't get to put her arms around Jackson and say,
she
I'm
never
here.
got to have a scene with just him.
And Mulder did, and that was upsetting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think I don't think she would have stayed home. I don't think that she would not have stayed home. They would have gone together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, anybody else?
So what do you think about some of the negative parts of the Scully Effect? Because one of the things that has happened is that a lot of female characters now, they can't be both smart and sexy. They're only allowed to be one or the other. And they're usually not allowed to be mothers or have a family or anything like that. They're kind of limited to just being smart and strong and not
So you're saying the limitations of just beyond the strong female character,
right,
kind of?
that they're only allowed to be the strong female character.
I would say that a lot of shows are now, I think a lot of shows are getting it right now.
Yeah,
I'm not seeing as many negatives, but there is a trope of just having a strong female character where they put her on the pedestal and there's not anything else. For example, only one woman in all of Star Trek is also a mother.
Yeah.
So that's just Dr. Crusher from The Next Generation. And, they do deal with a lot of issues, especially Next Generation being in the 80s. Those women were caregivers, and they came before Scully. But to see the women that came after Scully, even if you just look at Star Trek, B'Elanna became a mother in literally the last episode of Star Trek Voyager. So they're progressing towards that. I don't think now there are nearly as many negatives. I think maybe that was definitely true in late 90s, early 2000s. But Roy, what do you think?
I think there's more pressure these days because we have more kind of access to our shows where we can say, it's not really acceptable for this character to be that one-dimensional. She can still be an incredible scientist and still have a personal life and have hopes for becoming a mother, or she cannot want to be a mother, and she can have a
That's
fulfilling
completely valid too if
personal
you don't
life
want to have kids.
I think those attitudes are changing. I think it's going to take time. I think we are seeing.
I think we're seeing big
good
leaps.
changes,
I don't
but-
see that there's too many negatives of the Scully effect in my personal point of view, other than maybe just having a generic, strong female character that doesn't necessarily get the due that they're deserved. And that I think that's more of an issue, I think, in movies rather than TV.
Well, actually, the examples I was thinking of were a lot of CSI and NCIS
Okay.
have these female medical examiners. They're very much just a caricature.
A caricature.
Of a strong female character.
Interesting.
And they aren't really having a life outside of that.
Yeah, interesting.
I think, especially when you mentioned like NCS in particular, I think
Yeah.
that caters to like an older generation usually is who they're aiming for, and I think that holds back some of those characters. Because I go and I watch NCS and I can see how like certain parts of like, you know, America think that like the terrorists are like constantly coming to get us because that's what like the show portrays, and there's kind of that one-dimensional view. But I think if we look at other television, hopefully we're going to move.
Yeah, more
moving past
progressive
that.
TV,
Yeah.
more, and also like stuff like Jessica Jones, so that it makes like a point of having female directors and female writers, and you know, even Daredevil and you know, stuff like that. They're really trying to up the ante, and you know, Marvel is obviously behind. Captain Marvel is fantastic, but you know, she came out in 2019. We've had 17, 18 MCU movies before we got one led by a woman, so it's definitely still something that is, you know, just what my advice is for all fans is to follow the female producers and directors, amplify what they're doing, amplify what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, Michelle McLaren, she directed briefly and she produced for the X-Files, and she directs some incredible episodes of television that
Yeah,
you've
Breaking
probably
Bad.
seen and may not know it. And following like her work has been really interesting, and I think that's a good way to see the type of depth you want in your characters is to have like women who have that same depth, who have that experience they can bring with these shows. So encouraging them to, you know, studios to have a better balance and approach things, you know, in a more progressive way will help too.
Great, thank you for your question. Anyone else? We have a couple more minutes. We went a little bit over on the last panel, so we're just going to go a little longer. But for me, I think seeing what I'm looking most for, like, does anyone watch Outlander? Yay or nay? No Outlander fans? This is sad. You guys have to watch Outlander and The Expanse. You have homework. But yeah, just seeing like so in Outlander, Claire is a nurse in World War II, and she goes back in through these like a traveling. She's called a traveler in the books. She goes through the stones in Scotland, and she winds up in, you know, 100 years prior or 200 years prior in 1700 Scotland, and her way of relating to the world is an issue because they see her as being way, way too progressive. Like, oh my God, you have slaves. She thinks it's horrible, and of course it's horrible, but they think it's a way of life. You know, the way that she says, you know, this is what's wrong with this man. He has this wrong with him, and he's like writhing on the table in pain. And then there's a male doctor in the background going, no, he just needs, you know, to rest and he'll be fine. And she goes, no, he's going to die if you don't let me do your thing. And they don't want her to because she's a woman. And seeing her go through that and kind of combating an attitude 200 years in the past is like probably what women in, you know, the era of Star Trek would think if they look back on us, right? It's an interesting way of approaching storytelling for Outlander's point of view. And then Ron Moore, who's the showrunner on Outlander, he was the showrunner for Battlestar Galactica. He was a showrunner for a little while on Deep Space Nine and Voyager for Star Trek. And, you know, seeing his progression is kind of like seeing a progression of what has happened with Scully and what has happened with the women that have been, you know, these icons. You know, the women, the characters that are nominated for Emmys. You know, we're seeing a lot of more diversity. And diversity is important too. A lot of these characters we're talking about are white women, and having women of color, and women of color that, you know, like on like Luke Cage, like Misty Knight on Luke Cage. I love her. I think she's fabulous. She's law enforcement. You know, she's a cop. She's a total descendant of Scully. So is Shuri from the Marvel, from Avengers, Black Panther's little sister. I think eventually they might try to have her take up the Iron Man mantle. The next Iron Man in the comics is a young woman of color. And I think that it's really important that not only, you know, do we see these women who are, have that, that white privilege, as you call it, but to have women of color who are, of Asian descent and of African American descent and Native descent, and it's so important that we get that diversity, and we're not there yet by any stretch. Someone else is coming up. Yes.
Oh, I have a question. Is there a certain episode in the X-Files series that, as you're doing your undergrad or graduate degrees, that you were kind of like faced with this moment of maybe, like for example, I studied physics, and sometimes I was like, oh, physics is too hard and all these things, and then I, would turn back to the pilot episode, and she's, this physicist who's graduating from med school, and I was like, that's my goal. And so every time I have a hard time, I go back to that pilot episode where she's, the woman in the room, and she's standing up to Mulder, and, everything can be solved with science. You just have to know where to look. Like, was there an episode for you that kind of got you back on track of those times that you were kind of doubting yourself?
Oh, I love this question. Go ahead, Roy.
I think one of the best things Scully does science-wise is when she runs that 5-hour Southern blot, and the whole her using science to prove that there's this conspiracy that's harming her and people in America, and that she was able to do. I mean, it's a little improbable, but that
go with it.
That's what she used, what she knows to get some level of justice for when she had no control over anything else. And I think that's a really good example of Scully doing science the way only Scully can. Her, it was a beautiful scene, her in the lab, and that's just pure science. And I don't do a whole lot of pure science these days, but I think that's a good one to go back, and that whole arc is Jillian is just phenomenal. So that's if I were biochemistry, I might go back to that. Yeah.
I really love the Biogenesis 3-parter. I think that she, you're already, this character really well by that point. And to see what she does in order to help Mulder and how she goes to Africa, how many of us would travel to Africa, live in a tent, deal with the spooky, crazy stuff that she comes in contact with on the beach, the ship, the symbols, everything that's been going on, and just, I love that. I love that 3-parter. And then, she has to go back and figure out what's going on in order to save him, because, he's pretty much just out of it for those 3 episodes. He's not in it. He's, there's not a lot of Mulder-driven plot in that episode. It's all Scully. She's just doing all of it. And I love going back to that 3-parter, and I love rewatching it, not just because, I love that ending scene where they say, you're my constant, you're my touchstone, but that's using, like you said, using Scully as a touchstone, and you said that about having her throughout that series, just being there and seeing the lengths to which she would go. And I think I recently watched Little Green Men, where she goes down to Costa Rica and Mulder's down there, and she just kind of shows up and saves the day. These are great. This is great. When you need inspiration, you think how much effort did it take? So much. Just as much as going to Antarctica. People say oh, Mulder went to Antarctica for Scully and saved her. I'm yeah, but look at all the things she did for him. Anything else?
No, that was it.
Great, thank you for your question. Yeah? I think we're about to wrap. So thank you guys so much for coming to this panel. And if you want to follow us online, Roy, where can we follow you online?
Probably a lot of social networks, Twitter.
What's your at?
I think
Tell
I'm still
people.
Boston3346.
And I am Lightstar1013. I wonder why. Thank you guys so much. This has been awesome.